Welcome to our quick guide to HURREVAC, customizing the display and data. In this video, we'll cover many of the settings you can use to change the appearance of the program and some tricks that will help you tell stories with the data in HURREVAC. These topics may be especially useful if you are tasked with making graphics for briefings or sit-reps. This video is geared toward new users of the program as well as experienced users who would like to refresh their skills and see what's new, as some of the topics we're about to cover have been added in the past few years. As always, we encourage you to take advantage of our other training opportunities and resources, like the HURREVAC user guide and the YouTube recordings of our annual webinar series. So I've logged into HURREVAC, and this is what we have. As of 2024, by default, we have two things turned on: active Atlantic storms, as well as the tropical weather outlook. Now, on this particular day where we're recording this, there are no active Atlantic storms, and the tropical weather outlook is clear. If there were any outlook areas, that would be giving us a useful heads up about potential hazards, but that's not our focus today. So we'll close out of that product by clicking the X in the upper right corner of the tracking map, which also clears it from the legend. The very next thing I'd like to show you is how to magnify all of the elements in the workspace. So depending on which browser you're using and the exact dimensions of your monitor or laptop or the big TV screen you're trying to put the program on, sometimes the text can be a little bit smaller than it could actually be. And so to make things larger, click Control+ at the same time on your keyboard, the Control button and the plus button. And you see there that incrementally increase the size to 110% magnification. Sometimes you might be on a screen where 125% helps you see things better. But any more than that, sometimes that can start to push the buttons off the side of the workspace, and we don't want to lose that information. So if you're trying to adjust back down in magnification, click Control- at the same time, and just play with that and see what works best for you and your device. I'll leave it at 110% for the rest of this video. Then the next thing we'll take a look at are the basemaps, because the tracking map is such a central part of our workspace here. If you're a new user, your tracking map probably looks like this, but there are actually 9 different options for how to display information on the map. To look at those options, we'll click Basemaps, a small button in the lower right corner of the tracking map, and that opens a menu with 9 thumbnails that preview the look of the 9 different basemap options. And I'll show you a few examples in particular. The classic base map matches the legacy look of the HURREVAC program as well as many of the NHC maps. So with the classic base map, it doesn't offer very much detail on the local level, but it is very nice for making basin-wide or ocean-wide maps, as the labels do stand out a little bit better. And this is also particularly useful for our users in the Western Pacific region. If you're ever dealing with storm surge data that has a lot of colors, you might find that the dark gray canvas or the light gray canvas can really help you interpret those colors instead of having the colorful data on top of a colorful base map. And if you're doing more work with the program on the local level, you might find that either the streets base map or the imagery base map can help you detect what kind of land usage you're dealing with and where there are roads and where there may be structures. And just to show you a quick example of that, I'll use my magnifying glass tool to zoom into a portion of South Florida. And you can see that as I get closer and closer into these neighborhoods, that more detail emerges. And remember, our shortcut for returning to the home map view is called Zoom to Full Map Extent. It's the icon that looks like a globe in the upper right corner of the map. For now, I'll change the base map to the bright color canvas, but you can use whatever you prefer. A lot of the customization inside of HURREVAC happens with user preferences, and we can access that from the icon about midway down the right side toolbar. And that opens a small window on top of the tracking map. There are 4 tabs inside user preferences. Base location and POI style settings we won't cover right now, but we'll spend time inside the map settings first. Here's where you can choose units for speed and distance, whether it's miles per hour or knots or nautical miles. You can also choose a default base map that's always selected every time you log into the program. You can also control the look of latitude and longitude lines on the base map. You can make it lines only, you can add tick marks at 1 degree intervals, and also you can clear the lines entirely. Some other settings that may be of particular interest to people who are working on national or global watch desks is the ability to change and customize your time zone and time clock. By default, HURREVAC is set up to match the time of your device. So if you're working in the Eastern time zone, it will show most of the information in Eastern time. However, if you would like your map to match what your colleagues are doing or generate a map for another area, here's where you can select a UTC offset. And once you do so, then you can give it a custom label. And if you would like to show 24-hour time instead of 12 hours with AM and PM, you can make that selection in the time clock row. And that's a new feature for 2024. The final row under map settings is where you can customize that home view when we click zoom to full map extent, as I did earlier. And the final tab in user preferences is the display mode. And this is just a color theme for the program. It doesn't change any data or functionality. As indicated by the thumbnails, there are 4 different options: a light mode, classic, blue, as well as a dark mode with high contrast. And it's really whatever you'd like it to be. Once you make your selection, HURREVAC will remember that for the next time you log in. So closing out of user preferences, now I will go to the Storms tab at upper left to search for an archive storm that we can use as an example. And using the Filter Storms bar, I will search for Florence. In 2018, click the checkbox next to its name, and it loads on the map. HURREVAC always loads to the most recent advisory for archive storms, which in this case is the very last advisory, Advisory 77. But we'd like to look at an earlier time in this storm, so we'll use the Storm Status bar at top, and click the advisory menu and scroll to select advisory number 44. And if you're following along and you're a new user, you might already notice that the track depiction here and the labels look a little bit different than what you might have in your HURREVAC. And it's because I've already done some work to customize the labels in my version of HURREVAC and some of the track information. So I'll show you how you can do that too. But before we adjust the track, I'll show you one more adjustment you can make to get as much of the map on the screen as possible, and that is to collapse the left side panel. So in the map layers header at upper left, there's an arrow that points to the left. And if I click that, that will collapse that panel to the left. I can always bring it back out by clicking this arrow again. So to customize the look of the track and the labels, I'm going into Track and Swath options. It's the 4th button from the bottom to the left of the tracking map that looks like a gear. And this window, it does have a lot of different buttons, and we won't show every single one. We welcome you to play around with it. And I'll start at the very top. Now, you might already see when you're logged into HURREVAC and you look at an archived storm that there are 2 tracks. There's the forecast for a particular advisory, and then the actual track, which showed where the storm actually went. So for simplicity's sake, I have actual track ahead turned off when I do these demos, but that's where you can make that adjustment. The next one down is the actual track behind, or past track. And the way I have it set up now, it does show 1 square for all of the previous advisory positions. But I can simplify that to a track line only, and that puts more of the emphasis on the forecast portion of the track. Now we move into the labels. And you notice from this checkbox, if I turn that off, we don't have any labels at all. And you can control whether you'd like labels for forecast points, or past advisories, or both, or neither. You can control the interval of the labels, whether it's 6, 12, or 24, or 48 hours. And you can also adjust what kind of information is shown in the labels for these forecast points. So I have Saffir-Simpson category turned on. Sometimes it's also very useful to show the projected forward direction and speed of the storm, especially when we're looking at slosh products. So if you get things the way you like it, and you would always like that look on tracks whenever you log into HURREVAC, you would click the button at the bottom called Save These Preferences for Future Sessions. While I still have this open, I'd like to show you that you can rearrange the position of these labels. And if you look at Southern Virginia, there's that label that says Saturday 2 a.m. And as I do so, there's a blue dot over the left side of that label. And if I click and hold and drag, then I can reposition that label wherever I'd like it to go. And I can do that for some of the labels, like if it's covering up an important city name, or I can just choose a few. Just keep in mind that this is a temporary adjustment to the labels, so if you make other changes and then go back, you might see that these labels are repositioned automatically again. So I would advise that repositioning the labels is always kind of the last step you do before you try to save or export a graphic. And the bottom section of Track and Swath options deals with the styling of some of our storm tools, the wind field, the wind swath, and the error cone. And to make things easier to see, I'll uncheck the labels and then turn on my forecast wind field as well as my deterministic wind swath, which are my first two items in the storm tools at upper left. And by clicking these radio buttons inside the lower section of the window, I could say that I want my forecast wind swath to be shown as a solid outline or a dashed line. So sometimes switching to that solid line or that dashed line can be helpful if you're trying to show multiple layers. So now I'll turn my labels back on, and as you can see, they did automatically readjust. I'll close Track and Swath options, and then also turn off those two storm tools I had. The next thing I can do to customize this map is to move the storm information out of the legend and put it into a window on top of the tracking map closer to the storm track. And that's something I can do with the right-click menu. And so if I just choose a point on the map and look down at my fourth item in the context menu, that's Storm Info box here. And when I do that, it moves all of that current information about Hurricane Florence into this box. And you see the legend is still there, but it is simplified. I can also collapse this legend entirely by clicking the small triangle arrow in the upper center portion of that legend, and if I'd like to bring that legend back up, I'll click that triangle again. So to remove this storm info box from the tracking map or to try again and reposition it, I would right click anywhere and click Return Storm Info to Legend, which is fourth from the top, and that takes me back to my default view. So let's say I would like to show some regional boundaries or make my state boundaries a little bit easier to make out on this base map. I would go back to open my left side panel and go into the Resources tab and look at my selection of resource layers. I have state and county boundaries. Now remember, the counties and the parishes and their labels don't really show up until we zoom to a closer level. But I also have the option to show the outlines of the FEMA regions and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer districts, and new for 2024, I can show the NWS office county warning areas. But I'll leave the state boundaries on for the rest of this demo. I might be looking at my time of arrival graphic in the Storm Tools bar, which is sixth from the top, and with the most likely graphic on, notice that I have labels for that time of arrival, but I also have those track labels that indicate where the center of the storm will be. And some of those labels are colliding and can be a little bit unclear. So here's where I would go back into Track and Swath options to turn off the track labels for the forecast points, which just focuses the labels on the time of arrival graphic. That can also make it a little bit easier to see if I were to start placing wind timing flags. And with a time of arrival graphic, I have the most likely arrival as well as the earliest reasonable arrival. And I can add labels on this map using the underlying data that's used to create the time of arrival graphic. And in my right-click menu down at the bottom, near the bottom, place wind timing flags, and in the submenu, click place wind timing flags. And now I have a label there over Manteo, North Carolina for Wednesday 9 p.m. is the earliest reasonable time of arrival. And I can continue to do that for various points up and down the coastline. And that's the same data that HURREVAC is using when it makes wind timing reports, but we'll cover that in more detail in another video. Sometimes it can be useful to look at the time of arrival graphic along with the graphical wind probabilities, so we don't just see when the winds might arrive, but how likely they are to do so. And know that HURREVAC stacks things up, it layers them in the order that you turn them on. So because I turned the graphical wind probabilities on second, that is on top of our time of arrival graphic. So to control the opacity and the display order of our map layers, I'll go to Quick Layers options, which is third from the bottom, just to the left of the tracking map. And I'll select the row for wind timing and use the arrow in the header to move that selected layer up in the display order, and there it's much easier to make out against that colorful map data. I could also change the opacity of the wind probabilities to make it a little bit lighter or a little bit darker. I can also move my state and county boundaries on top of all the other data layers. So I can either turn my storm tools off one by one or click the Reset Storm Tools button to clear that from the map. Because the next thing I'd like to do is measure how far the center of Hurricane Florence is from Cape Hatteras at this point in time. And I'll zoom in just a little bit more to make that easier to see. So let's go to one of our tools on the Map Tools bar on the right side of the workspace, and it looks like a little ruler. It's called Measure Distance. And once I have that selected, notice that wherever my pointer goes, a small gray circle follows it. And wherever I click next, that will start my measurement. So if I were measuring from Cape Hatteras, I would click there first, and then as I move my pointer around, it updates with a preview of the distance with that dashed line. And I'll get as close to the center of Florence as I can. And if I were to single click, that would just make one line segment and keep going. So to end the measurement, I have to double click. And so I double click there and see that it's 1,218 miles or so from Cape Hatteras to Florence as of Advisory 44. I can make as many measurements as I want. Notice that the tool is still highlighted. So I could measure and see how far from Myrtle Beach is the center of Florence. And that second line appears on the map, and that is, when I double click, ended at 1,342 miles. To clear all my measurements from the map, I can click the Measure Distance tool again. If you click the arrow to open the menu beneath that tool, you see there's also an option to measure area too. The neighboring tool right below it looks like a pencil, and that's called Drawing Tools. When I open that up, I get a small menu that contains several different things you can do to add annotations on top of the map. You could make a simple line drawing, clicking that tool that looks like a pencil, and then dragging and holding the pointer gives me a freehand line drawing. Or I could make some text appear on top of the map. In the upper right corner, I click Draw Label Text, and I'll just make it say Test, and click OK. And wherever I click will apply that label on top of the map. And so really you can do whatever you'd like to do with the drawing tool. Or if you'd prefer, you can export a map from HURREVAC and put your annotations on top of it using another program. I'll clear my drawings from the map by selecting the Eraser tool at lower right, dragging a box around all of my drawings, and clicking Yes in the notification to remove them. So speaking of exporting graphics, there is one export tool within HURREVAC, and we go down a little ways to the Print Export Map tool at lower right. And here I have the option to print to printer or to a PNG file on my desktop. But another good option, if you have access to the Windows snipping tool, is to use that so you can precisely select which portion of the map you'd like to export. And I've done a lot of clicking around and moving on this map. And sometimes it's nice if all of the exported graphics have the same map extent or domain. And that can be a little bit hard to keep track of. So know that you also have some options with these tools near the upper right that look like arrows called Go to Previous Map Extent to go back in time to the previous map views that we were looking at. And so if I really liked where I was exporting a graphic previously and want to go back to that map view, I can use these left or right arrows to cycle through that. So we hope this helps you get a feel for how you can change the look and the feel of HURREVAC to suit your device and to suit your needs. But there are several other ways you can make adjustments inside the program. And so to dig deeper into those details, we invite you to check out the HURREVAC user guide. Click the question mark icon in the lower right corner of the workspace, which opens the HURREVAC user guide in a new tab. You can either browse the individual topics in the Using HURREVAC submenu, or use the search bar in the upper right corner to find a particular topic.